Good morning. My name is Karen Cruz. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. As a member of the Worship and Music Committee here at First Parish Plymouth, Unitarian Universalist, it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our service entitled The Power of Stories. Our pastor, Reverend Art Lavoie, will bring a sermon on this topic. The first part of the service is being recorded. Our technical director is Paul Melville. The recording will end after the benediction, and you are invited to stay on for our personal milestones and our pastoral prayer, song of inspiration, and then to stay on to be in small groups for discussion, if you please, or conversation. Whoever you are, whomever you love, whatever you believe, wherever you are on your journey, you are welcome here. Come, walk with us this hour. Our worship service now begins with the call to worship from Hunting for Hope by Scott Russell Sanders. We compose the stories of our lives by casting thought backward and forward, remembering and anticipating. And now our hymn will be Around. Sandy has made a recording of singing all three parts of this round, and you join in. The words will be on the screen. Join in on whatever part seems most comfortable to you.
Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Where do we come from? Mystery, mystery. Life is a riddle and a mystery. Mystery, mystery. Life is a riddle and a mystery. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we
Good morning. I'm Reverend Arthur Lavoie. My pronouns are he, him, and his. Please join me in the words of the chalice lighting that is on your screen. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in freedom, to speak the truth in love, and to help one another. Deb is not with us this morning, and I will continue here with the Time for All Ages. Moving, just sitting here with you. So the Time for All Ages this morning, I have a story, and it's called The Broken Story by the Reverend Christina Leon Tracy. We all carry within us the stories that make up our lives. And maybe they were stories we were told about when we were little. And then there are stories we remember about things that happen and stories we create with other people. Well, once upon a time, there was a man with a story. His story had been carefully crafted. It began before he was born. And the story told of his loves and fears, his dreams, those that he was able to accomplish, and the dreams yet to come. His story was complete, tightly woven together. It told his whole life, including those things that still only existed in his imagination. He was so happy with his story, he carried it around to make sure it was safe. It was somewhat bulky and unwieldy, but he didn't mind. It was his story. The thing about the story, though, that it was very fragile. It could break easily. It was made up of many pieces, and it was held together only by his imagination. He was worried it might break apart at any minute. And there weren't any other people in his story. And so he grew more and more protective of the story. He held it even closer. As he went about his life, he checked on the story to make sure he was following it correctly. He avoided adventure and unknowns because, well, he was worried that they might break the story. And then one day, the inevitable happened. Without warning, his story broke. It was unforeseen. He hadn't done anything wrong at all, but there it was laying in 1,000 shattered pieces on the ground. With the sunlight glinting off bits of story he had so carefully protected for all of those years. He was heartbroken. And since his story, there was never anything in his story about how to put it back together, he was lost. What would he do now? He sat down next to the pile of pieces and he cried. A while later, a group of people came out of a nearby building and saw him sitting on the sidewalk crying, surrounded by a pile of broken pieces. He clearly needed some help. Well, what happened here? A woman asked. My story. It's gone. I worked so hard to build it, to protect it, to keep it from harm, and now it's gone. It's gone, he wailed. Oh, is this the story here? A man asked. Yes, look at it. There's nothing left of it. Well, it looks like it's here, not gone, said a child. We just have to put it back together. Put it back together? There's no way. You don't even know what it looked like. How will you put it back together if you don't even know me? The child was tenacious. Oh, don't worry. With all of us here to help, we'll put it back together in a way you would never even expect. You know, it might be even more beautiful than before. So they swept up the pieces of this man's story carefully and went together into the building from which they had come out. They poured him some hot coffee. They sang a song he had never heard before. The song was soothing. The coffee was warm. He began to feel hope again, that his story, maybe his story could be put back together. And it took a long time. Maybe it was days, maybe it was years, who knows? But they got it all back together and they added new parts and, well, they threw out some old parts that didn't fit anymore, but that was okay. The child had been right. It was more beautiful than before. And this time, the story was held together not only by his imagination, but the imagination and the support of an entire community. It wasn't nearly so fragile that more people were involved in the story. And it even allowed for adventure. Thank you.
The first reading this morning is by Jacqueline Lewis from The Power of Stories. Even though there are many ways to conceptualize identity development, I am working from a frame in which identity is formed by stories received from our culture via our families, our peers, and our history. By stories, I mean the telling, enacting, or embodying of historic and mythical events. Stories make meaning for people. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. I believe our identities are formed by stories told to us, about us, and around us. We are living texts, formed by multiple, interweaving, competing, and sometimes conflicting stories that we receive from our culture via our parents, other adults, our peers, the media, and congregational life. Stories about race, gender, theology, generational differences, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and class work consciously and unconsciously to form our identity. Stories also teach us values, ethics, and meaning. Stories help us to know who we are and who we are not. They create boundaries or borders for us. Identity development can be thought of as the process of refining, editing, redacting, and authoring one's own story in conversation with others. We find our identity in particular contexts: home, school, the marketplace, or church, to name a few. We can think of each of these contexts as a holding environment. Whereas the first holding environment is the mother's womb, we continue to develop in holding environments all along our adolescence and throughout adulthood. Leaders are griots, storytellers who preach, teach, and train others through their own complete identity stories, The second reading is by Parker Palmer from A Hidden Wholeness. Storytelling has always been at the heart of being human because it serves some of our most basic needs: passing along our traditions, confessing failings, healing wounds, engendering hope, and strengthening our sense of community. But in our culture of invasion and evasion, This time-honored practice cannot be taken for granted. It must be supported in special settings and protected with strong ground rules. Because our stories make us vulnerable to being fixed, exploited, dismissed, or ignored, we have learned to tell them guardedly or not at all. Neighbors, co-workers, and even family members can live side by side for years without learning much about each other's lives. As a result, we lose something of great value. For the more we know about another's story, the harder it is to hurt or harm that person. Instead of instead of telling our vulnerable stories, we seek safety in abstractions, speaking to each other about our opinions, ideas, and beliefs rather than about our lives. Academic culture blesses this practice by insisting that the more abstract our speech, the more likely we are to touch the universal thoughts that unite us. But what happens is exactly the reverse. As our discourse becomes more abstract, the less connected we feel.
Where have all the flowers gone? Long time passing. Where have all the flowers gone? Long time ago. Where have all the flowers gone? Young girls pick them, everyone. When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn? Where have all the young girls gone? Long time passing. Where have all the young girls gone? Long time ago. Where have all the young girls gone? Taken husbands, everyone. When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn? Where have all the young men gone? Long time passing. Where have all the young men gone? Long time ago. Where have all the young men gone? Gone for soldiers, everyone. When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn? Where have all the soldiers gone? Long time passing. Where have all the soldiers gone? Long time ago. Where
You know, there's not much I'm going to miss when we come back together in the fall to meet in person. But one thing I will miss are these beautiful musical visual creations that Jean and Sandy and the other choir people have put together for us during this kind of COVID time. They've just been so creative with the music and with what they've done. It's amazing. I imagine that some of you were fans of the TV show Game of Thrones. Well, I was not willing to pay for HBO, so I cheated, which is in keeping with the theme of that show pretty much. I followed some of the highlights by watching YouTube clips of the show. I got the gist of most of the story. One of the clips that I have watched a few times occurs in the final episode of the whole series, when the leaders of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros gather to choose who will rule over all of them. They have been fighting with each other for ages and have just come through a devastating war against a common enemy. Tyrion, one of the main characters throughout the show, when asked who he thinks should be the ruler, says the following: "What unites people? Armies? Gold? Flags?" He shakes his head, indicating none of these. "Stories," he then exclaims, "stories. There is nothing in the world more powerful than a good story. Nothing can stop it. No enemy can defeat it." He then nominates Bran to be king because of Bran's own compelling personal story, but more importantly, because Bran has been given the role of being the three-eyed raven, the mystic who knows all of the stories throughout the ages. Through his visions, Bran sees everything that has happened to all of them and their families. As Tyrion says, he is our memory, the keeper of all our stories. Tyrion is absolutely right, you know. Stories are the most powerful thing that unites people. You really cannot stop a compelling story, especially if it fits into our existing worldview. And most of the time, people will not believe a compelling story, a competing story, if they're already committed to the first one. Take, for example, what many are calling the Great Lie, the story that the recent election was stolen from Donald Trump. Even after all these months, there are tens of millions of people who believe that story and are doing everything in their power to make it true, even when, to most of us, it was never factually true at all. That's the great danger of stories, or a great danger of stories, because they don't have to be literally true to be believed. What is true for those who believe this great lie is that something about their way of life has been taken from them. This country, I think, has done a great disservice to the white working class who've lost so much of their lives and livelihoods in the last century. If you believe your way of life has been or is being taken from you, then you are looking for someone to blame. And you're more likely to believe this person who has plenty of blame to go around, this great defender of that way of life. You're more easily to believe that he had this election taken from him. As I said, we easily believe stories that connect to our own worldview. In her book, Grace Eventually, Annie Lamott reminds us that we are saved by stories. stories read to us at night when we were little, stories we read by ourselves in which we could get lost and thereby found. That's her quote. Let's remember back to our childhoods for a moment. Can you think of important stories that saved you? Books you could get lost in, and then actually found something of yourself there. For me, I remember getting lost and then found in the great J.R.R. Tolkien books, The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Those stories taught me about facing adversity with dignity, integrity, and grace. They taught me that sometimes you don't belong in whatever is the place and family of your birth, and that it's critical for you, for me, actually, for my survival, to find new forms of family and community to sustain me. I can remember when my nieces and nephews were little, and I think of stories I would read to them. I'd be amazed that there were favorite stories that they wanted read to them over and over again. The same is true of movies and TV. There are some compelling stories that they could not get enough of. We are truly saved by stories. They teach us about ourselves and the world around us. They show us what we might be able to achieve and how to build relationships and connections with others. They teach us what we should value. Stories can save us by giving us an understanding of what is going on in our lives and also giving us hope for the future. But just as much as stories can save us, they can also condemn us. If we are not careful about the books and TV shows and films that we and our children consume, about the stories we hear, if we're not careful, we might learn that we're not valuable and worthy at all when we don't see ourselves portrayed in a positive way. They might even teach us that there is something good and right about inequality, hatred, and violence. There are many stories, many religious stories, in fact, that teach us that there is only one way to be happy, healthy, and whole, and that we are condemned if we don't follow that narrow path. As children, we also believe that everything is magical and fantasy abounds. That's what our world looks like because we don't understand how everything works. I don't know if there are children watching now, so I'm not going to get into specifics here about some of the magical things that children believe. But there are lots of things we deeply believe as children that have no or limited factual basis. As we grow up and reality sets in and we understand more of how things happen, we lose some of the magic and wonder of childhood. But that can also be dangerous if we lose our belief in wonder and awe and stop seeing remarkable and astonishing things that happen all around us every day. Music is another medium that offers us an avenue to touch our stories. Where Have All the Flowers Gone, that we just heard, is a perfect example of a story within a song that lasts through the ages and touches people's hearts for generations. Reverend Jackie Lewis, who authored our first reading, is African American, and she's the minister of a church in New York City that has for many years developed ways of being a more intentionally diverse congregation. You'll actually be hearing more about Jackie next Sunday. In our reading, she tells us that stories about race, gender, theology, generational differences, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and class work consciously and unconsciously to form our identity. Therefore, we all carry assumptions based on those stories about ourselves and other people and other groups. These assumptions are based on the stories we've internalized from our families, from our life experiences, and from our culture and society. The stories are not only based on actual events, but also the way those events are interpreted in our particular worldview. Here's an example, being a Caucasian man of European descent, I hold the assumption, based upon my family history and the stories I've internalized about the American dream, for example, that if I work hard, I can succeed at whatever it is that I want to achieve. Many people who are African American and other people of color carry in their stories the legacies of slavery, Jim Crow, lynching, voting restrictions, redlining, police abuse, internment camps, and many other forms of discrimination and violence. They often have very different assumptions for their lives out of those stories. Their stories have led to the assumptions that no matter how hard you work or how good you are, there will always be someone ready, willing, and able to pull you down and try to destroy everything you have achieved. We need to know those stories as well and the impact that they have on people's lives. Over the last couple of centuries, we've been asked to change our stories and assumptions about the role of women in our society. The beautiful service that Sandy, Deb, and Jen offered a couple of Sundays ago spoke beautifully to that. But we have only begun that journey because our assumptions are so deeply embedded. And we've only scratched the surface of changing our deeply embedded assumptions about people of color and LGBTQ folks. This renewed emphasis on the power of story has also changed Unitarian Universalist preaching over the last half century. We now use more story-based theology and preaching styles. Gone is the time when Unitarian sermons were intellectual treatises. You know, ministers would spend the whole week researching and writing. Since Unitarian church members were often teachers and professors themselves, or were at the very least well-read, they were the upper layer of society after all. So they expected and judged the intellectual and theological rigor of the preacher's words. Today, we know that this is not what people want or need. At the very least, it is elitist. We have learned more of the power of story as a way to share a message that resonates with people's lives. In the Parker Palmer reading from his book, A Hidden Wholeness, he tells us that we feel too vulnerable and unsafe sometimes to tell some of our deeper personal stories, and that we seek safety in abstractions, speaking to each other about our opinions, ideas, and beliefs, rather than about our lives. But you know, we don't really feel connected to each other when it's not personal. In that same chapter, he goes on to share a story about a Quaker meeting he once attended. As you might recall, in Quaker meetings, there is complete silence unless someone is moved by the Spirit to speak. Sometimes the whole meeting proceeds in silence, the whole service. So at this one meeting, after some silence, a man spoke about the death of his best friend. and told a very moving story about an experience he and his friend had shared. Palmer writes, "I did not know the man or his friend, but the story he told took me deep into my own life. It brought my own friends to mind and reminded me of how precious they are, of how important it is that I let them know that." And then something uncanny happened. After another 10 or 15 minutes of silence, someone else spoke and shared the same things that had happened to Parker, how the experience of listening to the first speaker had made the connection to that person's valued friendships. Stories can have that kind of universal appeal. They have the power to speak to some experience that many, if not all, can share. They take us deep into our lives and connect us to the storyteller and to each other. Let us always remember that other people's stories are different, even though we can resonate with the truths found there. Let us always listen deeply and find the safe places to share our stories. Amen, and blessed be. Our closing hymn is "When Our Heart is in a Holy Place."
When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when we trust the wisdom in each of us, every color, every creed and kind, and we see our faces in each other's eyes, then our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when we tell our story from deep inside, and we listen with a loving mind, and we hear our voices in each other's words, then our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when we share the silence of sacred space, and the God of our hearts stirs within, and we feel the power of each other's faith, then our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place.
Our benediction this morning comes from the words of Penny Hackett Evans. Each of us brings a separate truth here. We bring the truth of our own life, our own story. We don't come as empty vessels. but rather we come as full people, people who have our own story and our own truth. We seek to add our truths and add to our stories. This congregation is rich with truth, rich with experience. All manner of people are here, needy, joyful, frightened, anxious, bored. We all bring our truth with us. May we recognize the truth and the story in everyone's life. And may we hear and honor the truths that we all bring as we gather together. Together we have truths. Together we have a story. Together we make community. Amen. And blessed be.